Good. Well, thank you for having me here allowing me to give this talk, share my thoughts with this important audience there in Tokyo. I think this is maybe the first time I've given a talk where I'm getting jet lag without the jet, so I had to get up very early here. Hold on one second. Sorry. But I'm very happy to do it because I'm going to be talking about something that I care a lot about and have been working on with a set of co-authors recently. Global supply chains, measuring exposure and thinking about risk. So let me just dive right into it. As you can see here on this slide, most of the talk is based on an NBR working paper that I wrote with Rebecca Friedman, who is an economist at the Bank of England and a former student of mine. And that paper has appeared in the Annual Review of Economics this year. Okay, let's talk about global supply chains. Now, the first thing I want to do is kind of address some misconceptions that I often hear when I talk about global supply chains with people, and especially when I'm reading about the global supply chains in the press and common commentators. And that is the point I want to make, is that not one size fits all. And I want to point out a couple important categories of global supply chains that make a difference when you think about fragility and risk and reshoring and all that sort of stuff. So global value chains vary by industry, country, company strategy, and distribution channels. And as a consequence, the nature of these things set up relationships that lead to risks that are likewise diverse. In other words, if you think about a classic problem that arose, say, during COVID, when maybe one factory in China was shut down and that caused disruptions all through the supply chain, that is an interesting example, but it doesn't apply to all the industries. And so the key point here is you have to think hard about what industries are vulnerable and what sort of shocks you want to worry about. The second big distinction is between simple and complex global value chains. Now, a simple global value chain, it's basically sourcing simple inputs from abroad. And this you'll often see in the food supply chain, for example, where a supermarket in, say, England will source, say, almonds in Tunisia. That is a supply chain, but it's relatively simple. The second one, which tends to characterize manufacturing, or at least some types of manufacturing, are complex. So here, the firms are sourcing sophisticated inputs from abroad or engaged in a lot of back and forth processing. So it's as if the factory crosses the borders and the goods are moving within a single factory. Now, those are very, very different things, and especially in industries like electrical and mechanical machinery or pharmaceuticals, these kind of complex chains are important and act in a very different way when it comes to risk. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that the reliance on foreign inputs is a mixed trend. So what I've done in this chart is take the three largest manufacturing countries in the world, Germany, China, and the US. And what these charts show is a measure of reliance on foreign inputs. So it's foreign value added and domestic final demand as a percent of GDP between 1995 and 2018. And as you can see, Germany has seen a fairly steady rise in its reliance on foreign inputs, whereas China, at least since the early 2000s, has seen a steady decline in it. And the US, it rose up to about 2008, and then it gently declined since. So the notion that global supply chains are becoming more important always and everywhere, that's just not factual. We've had a number of mixed trends. And a lot of the movement away from global supply chains, for whatever reason or another, has been going on for a long time. It's not a very recent a phenomenon, the reshoring and offshoring and that sort of stuff. That reshoring has been going on a while. So the second set of issues I kind of want to put into perspective is the global supply chain risk. And again, I want to emphasize that not one size fits all. And in the public discourse, there's often a kind of a belief of what this disruption looks like. And a lot of it has to do with the disruptions we saw in the early days of COVID or in the later days of COVID. But that's only one possibility. So here in this slide, I want to talk about the different kinds of risks to global supply chains. So on the left, I'm going to talk about sources, and on the right, I'm going to talk about types. So let me start with the sources. So when we're thinking about sources of supply chains, it's very, very important to distinguish between supply shocks, demand shocks, and transportation shocks. So for instance, the supply shock, I think this is the one that's most familiar to people. There was a very famous floods in Thailand, which disrupted auto production for quite a while. There was, for example, a shock to the supply of semiconductors early in the last couple of years. And that came from particular problems that came from for particular companies. But there's also demand shocks. And one of the highest profile demand shocks led to problems inside the United States for the last, say, 18 months, or at least during much of the COVID time. And what happened there in the United States was not a supply shock, it was a demand shock. So what happened was that people who were locked down in COVID stopped spending money on services, things like hotels, restaurants, eating out, travel, things like that. Since they couldn't really do them, they had money left over that they decided to spend on goods. And moreover, when they were spending on goods, they were buying it online, not in shopping malls. So this twist in demand from services to goods and from purchasing in retail outputs to purchasing online led to problems in the supply chain, which led to delays in delivery and therefore increases in price. But you see, that source of the demand was an unexpected shift in the way American consumers spend their money. There was similar sorts of things that went on in Europe, and I'm not sure about Japan, but I suppose it was a similar thing there as well. And then the third one, which we all saw, for example, when this ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, is transportation shocks. So these transportation shocks are interrupting the connection between the supply and the demand. So the source of the shock is neither disruptions to production and supply, nor unanticipated shifts in demand, but rather just disruption of getting the supply to the demander. Now, for example, a very big one during COVID was in Singapore. Very strict COVID lockdown restrictions prevented crew changes on many of the cargo boats. And since Singapore is kind of an entrepreneur or a hub of all this transportation, the fact that the crews couldn't change in Singapore led to a lot of disruption of movement of containers and container ships, which led to, again, shortages of supply in Europe and the US, and rising prices. So that's the sources of supply. Let's keep those separate: supply, demand, and transportation. Now, on the right column, I want to talk about the types of supplies. And here I think this is what's really changed. If you ask me what really changed, why is everybody talking about global supply chain disruptions and fragilities, nearshoring, weaponized independence, all these sorts of things? It's in this column that I want to talk about it. So let's start with the idiosyncratic shocks. So these are things like earthquakes, labor strikes, port shuttage, big storms that maybe shut down a particular port. And these are idiosyncratic in the sense that they happen in unanticipated ways. They're not really things you can avoid. But on the other hand, they happen fairly frequently. And the companies engaged in international manufacturing have taken account of these kinds of shocks, and they've arranged their supply chains with full knowledge that the supply chains will face these idiosyncratic shocks. So they've built in a certain amount of redundancy or resiliency or whatever, balancing the cost of having redundancy or resiliency against the gains from being able to continue despite a shock. And so in many ways, there's not much to fix here. The companies have been forever aware of these things, and they are taking proper, or they are taking measures to guard against it. Now, the second line in this right column, I'll talk about systemic risks. And I think this is what's really, really changed. The world for decades has, the world of global manufacturing has for decades been aware of idiosyncratic shocks. But what's really become important basically since COVID, maybe even since 2016, is systemic shocks. And what I mean by systemic shocks, it's shocks that affect many sectors over many months and many countries. So, for example, the classic systemic shock was COVID-19. COVID-19 hit the whole world, not exactly at the same time. The lockdowns were in Asia were in different times than the lockdowns in Europe and US. But in any case, it was a very, very systemic shock because it affected basically all the sectors and all the countries for a very long period of time. The procedures and systems that had been set up by global manufacturers in order to adjust to the possibility or allow for the possibility of idiosyncratic shocks were not capable of dealing with systemic shocks. So that was what happened, why the supply chains fell down and were so difficult, is because the nature of the shock, especially COVID-19, was systematically different. But it's not just COVID-19, which is hopefully ending. It's climate change is a systemic shock. And how is that? Well, climate change will lead to warmer weather, has led to warmer weather, and that then leads to more extreme storms. And some of these storms could conceivably knock very important ports offline for several months at a time. So the example there was the Hurricane Sandy a few years back, knocked the port of New Orleans offline for 6 months. So as we get more and more energetic storms, it's possible, in fact, likely, that some of the key hubs in the transit network, the transportation network, will be knocked off for substantial periods of time due to storm damage. The third is the US-China geoeconomic tensions. So, and when I say US and China, those are, as always, US is a figurehead for one group of countries and China is a figurehead for another group of countries. And the tension between these two camps is creating possibility and reality of trade barriers, whether it's sanctions or restrictions on exports or tariffs on imports, which are affecting many sectors, many countries, and over prolonged periods of time. And again, the things that the companies did to adjust to idiosyncratic risk are not the same things that help them deal with this kind of systemic risk. And lastly, digital disruption. It's a little harder to know how it's going to happen, but digital disruption is changing things quickly, and it's possible, whether it's cyber attacks or changes to the financial system, whatever, that could disrupt trade systemically. Okay, now let me go on next to recovery concepts, and this is in the spirit of talking about how we should think about, how we should need to structure our thinking about global supply chain risk. So in this literature about logistics and supply chain recovery, there's two very different concepts, robustness and resiliency. And robustness is the ability to continue during the shock. This is very hard to do in complex global supply chains. In complex global supply chains, each supplier is very difficult to certify, to set up, to make sure it's up to standards. So if one of those producers of sophisticated parts goes offline for whatever reason, it's very hard to continue producing to go through. That brings companies, often in the electronics industry or the car industry, to the idea of resiliency. And resiliency is the ability to recover quickly after the shock. Now, these two concepts of recovery are important because the types of strategies that firms and governments can take in order to ensure robustness are very different than for resiliency. And robustness may work with simple supply chains where you could have lots of multiple suppliers you could switch between if one of them has problems, where when you have very sophisticated supply chains, you basically have to go with resiliency because you can't afford to have multiple producers of very sophisticated parts. Okay, now let's come to the kind of policy question. And this policy question is, are global supply chains too risky? So the answer is, well, it depends, as usual in economics. Now, what I'd like to do is, if I can advance here. Okay. What I'd like to do is invite you to think about the risk versus reward in supply chains, very much like we think about risk versus reward in our portfolios, financial portfolios. So what I've got here is a little diagram, a schematic diagram with risk on the vertical axis and reward on the horizontal axis. And in this case, with supply chains, the reward is the cost savings. So for example, a very classic one would be that you would, to save the maximum cost, you would put all your orders for inputs to the cheapest producer available. And that would be the lowest cost, but it would be risky because that supply might be disrupted. And then as you diversify suppliers, you're getting less cost savings, but you're getting lower risk. So this is how the frontier looks like. This blue line here is the perceived risk versus reward frontier. And as you get more cost savings, you also get more risk. And it also starts to curve up because as you concentrate your sources, the risk increases essentially as the diversification is going down and you're concentrating on the very cheapest one, the perceived risk reward frontier curves up. Now, private firms look at this trade-off. They don't like risk and they do like cost savings. So they have an indifference curve that's moving down to the southeast, where it's getting higher as it goes southeast. And there will be a point where they find it optimal, the optimal reward versus risk at this point P, which is when their indifference curve is tangent to this risk frontier. So this is really just standard portfolio analysis. Now here, if this is all there is to it, then there is no need for policy because although there's risk, the private sector is taking account of that and acting as they do. When we do need policy is when the public versus private trade-off between risks are different. So here we have the same diagram as before with the private trade-off indifference curve in green. And we have an illustration of a public trade-off in which risk is weighted higher. So here we see that the public indifference curve between risk and reward gives less weight to reward and more weight to risk. So the socially optimal position of risk versus reward involves a lower reward and a lower risk. And this is what we call the public-private wedge of perception of risk. Now, when that happens, there is an argument to intervene in order to reduce the risk that private companies are talking about. Another classic case or a cause of this could be that there's imperfect information. There's a misperception of risk by private companies. And so it might be that the actual risk versus reward frontier is this dashed black line when they think it's this blue line. So as it turns out, they're taking more risks than they know because they don't really understand all the risk in their supply chains. And this is a real thing. Even the most sophisticated companies don't know all the suppliers in their supply chain. Okay, so what policies are needed? I'm going to make just 3 points here. I only have a couple more minutes. First is anti-risk policy types. There's really 3 big types. subsidize private local production, as happens in the food industry. The second is intrusive risk regulation, forcing reshoring, stockholding, or information requirements. This is a little bit what's done in the financial sector to control risk in the financial sector. It's mostly regulatory. And third, massive public stock holdings, where the government itself holds stock in order to smooth out any kind of shocks. Now, the point is that you need to match policies to shocks. So, for example, if the shocks you're worried about are coming from demand shocks, as happened in the last few months, the only thing you can really do is stockpiling or set up excess capacity, because diversifying the supply doesn't change the fact that there's not enough supply for the unanticipated demand shock. So really, you have to put a buffer into the system, and that's very expensive. But if you try and say, I'm going to diversify production location in order to take care of demand shocks, you won't be coming up with a policy that actually addresses the problem. Now, the second is idiosyncratic supply shocks that we talked about before. And there, one solution is to geodiversify the supplies, because the problem is there's going to be an earthquake here, or a flood there, or a typhoon there. And if you diversify your supply sources geographically, then you can reduce the risk through that. And if you're thinking about international transportation shocks, then reshoring may in fact help, because you avoid the international transportation, although there's shocks at home as well. The next point is you have to match these policies to the shocks. So with the systemic shocks, like the geoeconomic shocks that are heating up between the US and China, then reorganizing supply chains to rely on allies or nearshoring or identifying strategic sectors is probably the right way to go. And the last point there of identifying strategic sectors is that one needs to realize that you can't do this with everything, or it'll be very, very expensive to do it with everything. But the risks are only really coming from a few key industries. So identifying those key industries and then encouraging policies to reduce the risk in those particular industries is a good idea, rather than trying to get absolutely everything geodiversified or reshored. Now, I just want to give examples of sectors that have anti-risk policies. So there are certain sectors of the economy that every government all through time has recognized as especially fragile or risky, or in particular, where the private perception of risk is not as important as the public sector perception of risk. And therefore, governments all across the world, across many, many time periods, have decided to intervene. The first and most obvious is agriculture. And countries all around the world engage in stockholding to take care of transportation and demand shocks. And many of them provide reshoring subsidies, like farm subsidies, the Farm Bill in the US, Common Agricultural Policy in Europe, which encourage local production. So the governments spend a lot of money over a very long period of time in order to reduce risk in agriculture, because they realize they can't rely on the private sector to undertake the anti-risk strategies that are necessary for the society or are optimal for society. The second one is finance, and it's very clear that the finance industry, the public perception of risk is much greater than the private perception of risk. And the way the governments do this, basically every government all across the world, ever since the 1930s, they engage in regulation and a very elaborate surveillance and enforcement, which is very expensive, involves very large government bodies of people making new rules and keep making sure the rules are done. And it's very onerous on the banks, causes a lot of expenses and things. But the political consensus in countries all around the world is that these expenses are worth it to avoid or reduce the social risk. In a strange way, the military is also one of these. So military is the demand for defense services, and defense services are sorts of things where there's going to be enormous demand shocks. In other words, you don't need it for decades, then all of a sudden you need it today. And you can't wait for setting up new production facilities and changes. You need it today. So what governments all around the world do is they have their own defense services owned by the government and controlled by the government. And these armies maintain enormous stocks at a very expensive cost. And they insist on certain amounts of armaments and whatnot produced locally. And they have all the spare capacity, which is financed by the public. Now, Switzerland is another example. When Switzerland, there's a systemic excess stock holding by private corporations, usually retailers, and this is all subsidized by the government. So the government pays the local supermarkets and pharmacies to keep excess stock just in case. Okay, couple no regrets policies. So the first one is supplier information. The information about the global supply chain is something that is lacking around the world, and governments could help provide clarity in the global supply chain. So that's one thing, is just to gather the data and release it. We have some databases which are publicly available, but they tend to be very aggregate, and this could be done at a more aggregate level, especially for the most sensitive sectors. The second is to conduct stress tests of critical supplies, and some countries are doing this. For instance, the Bank of England is asking some British corporations to conduct stress tests on their supply chains in the name of financial stability of those corporations. Lastly is macro circuit breakers. So the macro stabilization and firm worker support policies that we saw during COVID in most countries, those dampened the snowball effects of disruption, leading to bankruptcies, leading to more disruptions, leading to more bankruptcies. So that macro circuit breaker was something that worked really very well. Okay, so I don't have a lot of time, but I'm just going to go quickly and then leave time for Q&A. I'm going to talk now about mismeasurement of foreign reliance. So this, again, is something we've detected in the public debate and government discussion frequently, is the measures we have of how exposed companies and countries and sectors are to foreign risks is often mismeasured. So the question is, how much exposure is there to foreign suppliers? And I would argue that a lot of the things we're using now to measure that are based on relatively outdated views of how industry works. So sometimes people just look at the gross imports, let's say the gross imports of the United States of car parts from China into the US car industry, just the customs value as it crosses the border. And they view that as a measure of exposure. The other thing which are used that take account of global supply chains are things like backward and forward linkages, are measures, but these measures were developed to see how countries and sectors were engaged in global supply chains when more engagement was a good thing. Here, because foreign exposure may be a bad thing or certainly something you want to worry about, using the measures for global value chain that were developed to look at nature of engagement aren't really appropriate or correctly specified for the measures. And this is the kind of main point of the paper, another paper I've written with Rebecca Friedman and Angelos Theokopopoulos. So here's one way to think about it. And it's like a question, like a thought experiment. Where is a Detroit-made Ford actually made? Now, there's three levels of answers here, all of which are true. The first level is that, of course, it's made in Michigan. Ford rolls off the line somewhere around Detroit, and therefore it's made in Michigan. That's the truth, but not the whole truth. Because, of course, the Ford requires inputs, some of which are sourced from abroad. So the second level is the inputs that go to that car factory in Detroit to assemble the Ford that then rolls off. So the second is looking at imported imports, which is giving you an idea of the foreign exposure. But that still is not the full answer, because the imported inputs themselves use imported inputs from other countries. So the third level, which is the full answer, takes account of all the inputs into all the inputs of the car. And that way the foreign involvement is massively complex and can come, let's say, China provides certain parts to the German car industry, which then makes a component, which is then exported to the United States and put into this Ford. Then the factory in Detroit may also be importing some parts directly from China, but the true exposure to China of the US car industry then is the Chinese parts that go through Germany and the Chinese parts that come directly. So that's what we call Leontief imports, because you need to do a little bit of algebra and use the famous Leontief inverse matrix to figure that out. That's the things you see in the OECD's trade and value added database or the Asian input-output database. Okay, now what I want to show is that depending upon how you measure these inputs, you get very, very different answers for the same question. And the takeaway from this is you have to think hard about what measures you want to use or should be using when you analyze foreign exposure. So let's say if this left chart here, we're going to look at direct imports only. So if you look at, this is the weighted average of the foreign production exposure on the import side of the whole world on selected nations. So this blue line is how the whole rest of the world, or the whole world, including the US, depends upon inputs from the US. And you see from 95, first it rose, and then it's been declining. And China, the inputs from China have been rising very steadily. But even at the end of the period in 2018, according to this measure that's direct imports only, US is still a more important supplier of industrial inputs than China. But if you take account of the direct and indirect imports, these Leontief imports, then you see that China became a more important supplier for the world in industrial inputs from about 2010. So if you ask, who is the most important supplier of industrial inputs? If you use the measure in the far left panel, you get one answer. If you use the one in the middle, you get another answer. Now, which one is right depends upon what kind of shock you're worried about. For instance, if you're only worried about disruptions to direct imports, not indirect imports, then the left chart, that measure called OFPEM, that's the right one. But if you're worried about disruptions to Chinese production to other countries as a whole, then the middle one is what you have to look at. And this is all in terms of gross flows. In other words, the actual values when they cross the borders. One other aspect is if you're worried about the value added, not just the gross amount, then this far right panel is showing the direct and indirect imports that countries, manufacturing countries all around the world buy, but on a value added basis. So the value added basis strips out the back and forth of a component crossing the border multiple times. And here again, you see that the US is still the leading supplier of industrial inputs in a value added terms, higher than China, although the patterns are still somewhat similar. Okay, I'm going to very quickly, I know I'm a little bit over time, sorry about that. I'm going to make one more point, and I have 4 or 5 slides, but I'm just going to point to one. So the point here is that unscrambling the omelet will be hard. So what I'm saying here is this idea that we can undo, simplify, reshore supply chains is going to be something that's very, very difficult, very expensive, and take a long time. So we ought to think very hard about how much of it how much governments really want to do. And I think in the end, it's going to come down to which sectors do they want to do it in rather than overall. Okay. So here we're going to be looking at the foreign share. The measure I'm going to be using is foreign share of industrial inputs used in a nation's manufacturing sector as a share of all. So the numerator is the foreign inputs, the denominator is all inputs. So it's naturally in a share. And this is coming from the paper I mentioned before, Baldwin, Friedman, and Theodorakopoulos. Okay, so this is the data. This is how we present the data. It's kind of like a heat map of who sells what to who. So what the data shows is the percent of the column nation's total manufactured intermediates sourced from the row nations in 2018. So for instance, if you look at the Canada's sourcing from the United States. It's 15% of all the inputs that Canada uses come from the US. Down here, Mexico, it's 1.7%. Mexico sources 12% from the US, for example. And these are all the numbers here. I want to make a couple quick points about this. First of all, the central role that China plays in global supply chains and manufacturing. So the colors are dark, and what you can see is that the row of US, which shows the importance of the US as a supplier of inputs, is fairly dark, but China is by far the darkest, and systematically every number in this row is greater than 2.2%, which means all the major manufacturers around the world source at least 2.2% of their industrial inputs from China. So China is now really critical to everything. And that's why I say it will be very difficult to disengage China from the US or more broadly, because it's so engaged. Moreover, China is not very dependent upon foreign countries for its inputs. So this Chinese column shows China's dependence on the row countries for its industrial inputs. And you see these are all pretty small numbers, especially compared to the row. And I'm going to show here, this is the growth in reliance, and this is the change between 1995 and 2018. This is the OECD database. And you can see that the diagonals here are the extent to which countries have reduced own reliance on industrial inputs. And you see those are all negative numbers, with the exception of China, which has actually increased its reliance on itself. So all the other countries are in essence increasing the overall foreign dependence, but not China. And you can see that a lot of the increases, those are the positive numbers, have gone to China, and many of the decreases, say the US, there's many negative numbers here. And for Germany as well, you see so big negative number for itself, but relatively small numbers and some negative numbers. So that's the basic idea. We live in a world in which is very, very integrated in manufacturing, and China is absolutely at the center of that. So the idea of undoing this and coming back to less exposure to geostrategic shocks is going to be very difficult. So this is the conclusion. Conjectures linking geostrategic tensions with disengagement are flawed. The one point is it started way before Trump. As we saw, the engagement started falling in the 2000s already. The second point is China's role is exceptionally asymmetric, and it'll be very difficult, slow, and/or expensive to disengage from Chinese suppliers in global supply chains. So what we need is an interface that allows these two types of capitalism to thrive together rather than trying to separate or fracture the world. So I'll stop right there, and thank you for listening. Sorry, I went over a little bit.